It's here, in a tiny settlement high in the Andes mountain range of South America, that global trade begins. And that's because of what is discovered deep inside this mountain. The purest silver the world has ever seen. It is 1581, and a buyer appears for this silver. 11,000 miles away, the Emperor of China, the most powerful man on earth, has decided that his people must now pay their tax in silver. This series explores how the world is transformed when the King of Spain's silver meets the tax demands of the Emperor of China. It's a remarkable story that witnesses how China came to dominate at the dawn of world trade over 400 years ago.
The first time the whole world was linked into one global network, and the most important element of this is silver.
Silver allows China's emperors to become the most powerful men on earth. It's their demands for silver that are a catalyst for extraordinary wealth across the world.
The impact on the world economy was amazing.
Chinese craftsmen go on to create silverware of unparalleled skill and beauty that are coveted across the world.
Already in the 18th century, people were admiring this fantastic work because the wire is so thin, it's like hair.
China's silver trade drives the growth of some of the world's greatest cities: Boston, Hong Kong, Seville, and Shanghai. But it also sows the seeds of China's near destruction and leads to war with Western powers.
The British were determined to get a war. They got the war.
It's the time when China enters what's become nicknamed the century of humiliation, the period when China was not in control of its own external affairs.
But China struggles to let go of its obsession with this precious metal.
Only trust silver. It is almost like a religion in Chinese history. Silver is our gold in Chinese history.
This series reveals how silver changes China's history and the history of the world.
It's like holding a piece of history on your hand.
It is 1842. China is a battlefield. A war is being waged between China and Britain. Its cause? The illegal trade in British opium for Chinese tea. It becomes known as the Opium War. But the root cause of the war is conflict over silver. China needs nothing from the outside world apart from this precious metal. And that's become a major problem for the nations desperate for Chinese products, particularly Britain.
Lots and lots of products being made in China were very popular with people in Britain. Tea is one obvious example, and large amounts of silver was going to have to go back to China to pay for all this. So the British were rather keen to find some other commodity, perhaps rather less scarce than silver, to try and fill that gap. And it turned out that opium, if produced in mass quantities, would fill that gap extremely well.
The illegal trade in opium creates millions of addicts in China and sparks a social crisis. China reacts by seizing and destroying over 1,000 tons of opium.
Millions and millions of pounds worth, in today's money, of this precious drug is flushed into the Pearl River estuary.
China's destruction of British opium is made the trigger for war. China is vanquished and forced to hand over the port of Hong Kong to British control, as well as open 5 more ports to Western merchants.
So China found itself forced by violence to sign treaties which essentially said that foreigners would have significant control from that moment onwards in terms of how China's trade and government would operate.
Hard to believe today, but Hong Kong is dismissed at the time by Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston as a barren piece of rock. However, British merchants see this deep water port as an invaluable base where they can trade freely without Chinese interference.
This is a Chinese export picture of Hong Kong Island, and it's looking across the harbour, which was really the chief reason why the British wanted to have Hong Kong. The merchants were optimistic. I think they felt that once they could establish themselves beyond the reach of the Chinese authorities, which is what Hong Kong represented, then trade would be unrestricted, and that many of the problems which they'd suffered would go away.
Hong Kong becomes British territory, and they begin to stamp their culture on this former piece of mainland China. The hallmarks of British colonial life become evident throughout the port. In return, many British who now live there become fascinated by all things Chinese, including fine Chinese silverware. Their mementos can still be seen today in London's leading dealers of Chinese export silver.
Everyone wanted to come back from China with the tea set. But in Chinese silver, you could buy a tea set that told a story. Maybe a story of the Three Kingdoms, maybe stories of battles, court scenes. But in Chinese silver, almost everything that's got an inscription, it can be traced back to the original owner, because there are records. These pieces were given as trophies. This goblet, for instance, which was given as a prize in 1850 for a Canton regatta. One of the names mentioned is Augustine Hurd Jr. He was the nephew of somebody who was in partnership, actually in an opium business.
The loss of the Opium War and loss of sovereignty are a major shock to the Chinese. But there is also a sense that the war has also been driven by a profound clash of worldviews.
On the one hand, you had the view of what you might call the traditional Chinese court, the idea that China was at the center of the universe of ethics and behavior, and that foreigners coming to China would have to adapt to the norms of China itself. On the other hand, you have another very important force, the rising force of British capitalism and imperialism. Britain was becoming this big, outward-looking, buccaneering nation that was looking for new markets. And China, with of course its millions and millions of inhabitants and its unopened markets, became a place where it wanted to trade.
But in the wake of the war, sales of British goods in China remain poor. The British see no fault in their Yorkshire woolens and Sheffield cutlery, and lay the blame squarely with Chinese obstruction. They want even more ports opened and even fewer restrictions.
They have 5 ports, but why not 7? Why not 10? They have ports along the coast and to Shanghai, but what about the Yangtze River? How can they get closer to the markets? What about Wuhan, Hankou, along the Yangtze River? What about the north? Why should they still suffer restriction?
The British look for an excuse to bring back their gunships to China and press their claims. In 1856, they find one in Canton when Chinese officials board a British cargo ship and accuse the crew of being pirates.
他的船在广州啊，洋这个黄埔贸易的时候呢，被缉事官员啊来检查，把英国的国旗啊悬挂在这个船上的英国国旗啊扯下来了。当时的英国的这个公使啊，法夏里呀，觉得是对于英国的一种侮辱，他就是以鸭罗号事件为借口，向中国发起了第2次战争。
This time, it's not just the British fighting the Chinese. Other Western powers see an opportunity for gain and join the assault on China.
You see the gathering together of different imperial powers, all seeking a slice of China. So if the British come in, the French also come in too, because they want to get more territory. The Russians, who are beginning to expand their empire, feel they can't be left out. And this means that during that time, you might say that the Second Opium War marks the moving into high gear of the European and Western powers in terms of trying to conquer parts of China.
When a joint Anglo-French force captures Beijing in 1860, it commits a shocking act of cultural vandalism. They first loot, then set alight the Emperor's Summer Palace, a magnificent complex of buildings full of priceless artifacts. It takes 3,500 British troops to set the entire palace ablaze, and the massive fire lasts for 3 days. The palace is destroyed by order of the commander of the British military force, Lord Elgin.
The destruction of the Summer Palace was very much an act of punishment. It was designed absolutely to humiliate and lower the standing of the Qing court at the time. Lord Elgin thought quite carefully about what gesture it was that they wanted to make. And in this particular case, they thought that something that really showed the Chinese elite, the court, that the civilization which they had built up so carefully and so thoughtfully could be destroyed so quickly would be a salutary lesson.
China is also forced to pay war damages to the British with the very silver they've been determined to import. 10 million silver taels in war damages, in addition to 21 million silver dollars from the First Opium War, more than half of China's annual revenue. The treaties China is forced to sign fully legalize the opium trade, as well as opening 11 more ports to foreign trade, allowing merchants access deep into the country's interior. The British National Archives in London hold copies of the key peace treaties, but it also holds a letter from the younger brother of the Emperor, Prince Gung, to Lord Elgin, which mournfully acknowledges Chinese defeat.
This essentially is a letter which you might almost say is the opening up of China to the wider Western world.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
I do wonder how Prince Gung, as a noble and high official of the Qing dynasty, must have felt authorizing this letter. He was sending it not just to anyone, but to Lord Elgin, the British official who represented a country which had essentially brought China to a position of submission, and along the way had, of course, destroyed the Summer Palace. I think Prince Gung would have sent this letter out with a pretty heavy heart.
Prince Gung is just 27 when he's thrust into the negotiations with the British. He is high-born and influential, but new to this world of international diplomacy.
Prince Gung was a very interesting guy. He was considered the most westernized and enlightened Manchurian royal in his age. The first time the Westerners, the British, saw him, on his right hand it was a glass of cognac. On his left-hand side was a cigar.
Prince Gung knows his country is close to collapse. Foreign troops are in Beijing, and China is in a bloody revolt. It has never been so vulnerable.
The truth was poor. China lost. And China had to play a catch-up game for the whole 20th century.
Prince Gung sets about a mission to transform China from victim to victor. It is called the self-strengthening movement.
洋务运动的背景当然是中国在面对西方的和西方发生冲突的时候， 那中国人就会觉得这是数千年未有之变局，就会在思考我们究竟输在什么方面。那他们其中的一种想法就觉得可能输在技术方面。那我们洋务运动的一个本质思想其实之一就是说，我们去学习西方的技术，然后就可以赶超他们。
Although sophisticated in terms of its high culture and its artisan crafts, China, in the middle of the 19th century, must make up vast ground lost to its industrial rivals.
China lagged behind in steam power, talking in terms of the Industrial Revolution. We had no idea that a steam engine ran on steam. If you think about it, you haven't seen how a steamboat works. How do you know it ran on steam? You thought it ran on fire, which was exactly what they did.
Prince Kung immediately focuses on modernizing China's defenses that were so easily crushed during the Opium Wars.
You have the creation of a new armed division, which are armed with Western weapons. You have the building of naval dockyards. There are moves towards establishing mines, as well as bringing steam vessels to replace old Chinese sailing junks. So all this is happening actually quite quickly and quite successfully.
Kung and his self-strengthening movement need silver to finance their reforms. Taxing China's foreign trade will supply him with vital funds. That leads him to one extraordinary institution.
The Imperial Maritime Customs Service was one of the oddest but most interesting organizations to exist in China through the mid-19th to mid-20th century. It served the Chinese government, bringing in tax revenue from tariffs, goods charged on goods being imported into China. But it wasn't run by the Chinese, it was run by the British throughout almost all of that time.
The British introduce a system of uniform custom tariffs for the first time in Chinese history, which has immediate benefits for international trade.
The maritime custom provided China with a very standard and national service. What does that mean? So any foreign merchant can ship their products to Shanghai or any other custom house, and they could speak English to talk to the local officials, to local commissioners. So there was a very reliable tariff protocol and a totally modern harbor management for them to do their business.
Then in 1863, it is Prince Kung who makes the Maritime Customs Service's most significant appointment, a man that shares his ambitions to modernize China. His name is Robert Hart, a brilliant young Irishman who has been in China working as an interpreter and diplomat since 1854. Hart has quickly formed a deep empathy for China that becomes a feature throughout the 77 volumes of his diaries that he keeps faithfully for 40 years. They are now kept in Queen's University, Belfast.
I am on the Chinese side, and I will help them to the best of my abilities. And I don't care who knows what I do or what I say. But I think that sympathy he had for China that comes through his diaries so very clearly.
He loved to learn Chinese. That's one very important thing. And then he forced all his subordinates to learn Chinese as well. He was interested in all sorts of different topics of Chinese medicine, music, arts, all sorts of things.
In Hart, Prince Kung has now added a vital foreign partner to his circle of modernizers, all of them determined to re-strengthen China.
Prince Dong called him our Hart, means Prince Dong saw him as a real friend.
For Prince Kung, the Maritime Customs under Hart is providing far more than just revenue.
It would create a translator's college, which was really meant as the office that would train China's diplomats It would also light China's coast, all the lighthouses, all this facilitating of navigation. It had a huge role in that. It would build about 26 custom houses. And my two favorite ones are the one in Urumqi, which is really in Central Asia, and it must be the maritime custom house furthest away from any bit of sea anywhere in the world. And the other one is the Yadong custom house, which is in Tibet, which again must be the custom house highest in the world, and again very far away. And for the Qing dynasty, by having these custom houses in Urumqi and in Tibet, these were markers of Qing territory. How clever. It would end up collecting about 30, 40, 50% of taxes available to the Chinese state. Huge significance.
Under Hart's stewardship, the maritime customs revenue increases from 8 million silver taels in 1865 to over 14 million taels 20 years later. Well over $1 billion in today's money. By 1893, maritime customs are providing a fifth of government income.
It became the biggest, maybe the most important financial pillar of the Chinese government, because it was it has very, very little corruption, much more efficient and effective.
Foreign trade increases through the recently opened treaty ports and exports surge. Silver flows into China once more. But China, with its dependence on silver, is falling out of sync with the global economy. After massive discoveries in America and in Australia, most of the world's leading nations have left silver behind and are now basing their economies on gold.
Chinese adherence to silver standard for a long time was considered something of a backward phenomenon. Any country that was respectable should join the gold standard. China was very backward, was so disorganized, it was not able to join the gold standard.
But the very idea of reform itself is challenged within the imperial court by a deeply conservative, ruthless, and powerful woman. A woman who effectively runs China in the last decades of the 19th century through her influence over the boy emperor, Guangxu.
The Dowager Empress Cixi is one of the most intriguing characters in modern Chinese history. She was literally a power behind the throne. She believed in the restoration of a very strong imperial rule, and she persecuted and even had executed some of the most important reformers in late 19th century China, who argued that actually China really needed to rethink, rework its system of government to cope with the modern world. She also had had a lot of money spent on the redecoration of the imperial palace, which some people argued could have been spent in a different way, instead for the fortification of the Chinese armed and naval forces.
Empress Cixi's dominance at court and her resistance to Prince Gung is undermining China's fledgling reforms. Just across the East China Sea, another empire is under threat from the West, but Japan's response could not be more different to China's.
Rather than trying to make do and mend, Japan actually overthrew its ruling class and instead undertook one of the fastest and most complete modernizations ever in history. The Japanese modernized their law, their army, their constitution, their education system, all within about 20 years or so, and as a result became a powerful imperialist power in its own right, and quickly would become every bit as rapacious, as greedy as the Western powers in terms of seeking rights and territory in China itself.
War breaks out in 1895. China's much heralded new navy is outgunned and outsmarted by the Japanese. All of China is appalled to lose so easily to their once weak and subordinate neighbor. China loses even more territory as it is forced to cede control over Korea and Taiwan to Japan. but it must also pay war damages of 200 million taels of silver, almost 4 times the annual revenue of Japan itself. This is an enormous boost to Japan, who suddenly have the financial reserves to join the leading nations of the world and base their economy on gold. It is utter humiliation for China.
This amount of money that the Chinese government has to pay to the foreign powers is a substantial part of its budget. Enormous indemnities of the sort that one can never pay off from the Chinese government.
In order to pay its mounting war debts, China must borrow massive amounts of money, but its financial institutions are not able to meet the huge sums required.
The Chinese did not evolve the kind of formal banking arrangements that you had in Europe. Chinese emperors did not think of owing debts. If they demanded it, you paid it. So they don't owe you a debt. So there's no such thing as a public debt in China. And if you didn't have public debts, you didn't have powerful banks. So Chinese banking was always weak.
In raising enough funds to pay for its war debts, China helps fuel the rise to power of foreign banks.
I would definitely say after 1895, the foreign banks' power came into China. The easiest reason was that because the Chinese government had to borrow money for its indemnities to Japan. So the Chinese government talked to HSBC and Deutsche Bank to borrow enough money to pay back to Japan. Then the HSBC became very important because every year the Chinese government had to pay back to the HSBC.
Increasing foreign influence over China is fueling more than just anger across China. It fuels rebellion. Just 2 years after the war with Japan, China erupts in revolt. An anti-Western movement that began in northern China is spreading like wildfire. The rebels call themselves the Boxers.
They call themselves boxers because of the martial arts they train with. They believe themselves to be invulnerable to foreign bullets, who believe that the world has been turned upside down by the eruption into China of foreign ideas and foreign things and foreign buildings.
The Boxers' slogan is "Revive the Qing, destroy the foreign," and it's a sentiment that finds sympathy in the imperial court. In June 1900, the Dowager Empress takes a decision that will result in the near destruction of the Chinese Empire.
This was a sort of anti-foreign feeling that in some ways spread through all levels of society. Cixi reflected that in many ways. For much of her life, she was someone who was very skeptical, indeed hostile, about the foreign presence in China.
Seizing the chance to drive all Westerners from China, in 1900, Cixi comes out in support of the Boxers and declares war on all foreign powers. But in less than 2 months, a military alliance that includes British, French, German, American, and Japanese forces reaches occupied Beijing and crushes the Boxer rebellion. Piled on top of its previous war damages with Japan, China is immediately ordered to pay a colossal and punitive 450 million silver taels, 1 tael for each of China's 450 million people, equivalent to $300 billion today. The Qing treasuries contain nothing like this amount. China now has to face the gravest threat in its 2,000-year history.
Many Chinese officials and observers think that, in fact, China faces national extinction. They talk about this, the threat of extinction. They know that the British had conquered India. They fear the same will happen in China.
During the tense negotiations, the Chinese are keenly aware of what is at stake for their country.
China could not risk her international reputation again, because China had to rebuild her international image as a trustworthy friend to the foreign states.
Behind the scenes, the Chinese turn to one man, a Westerner, ironically, who has the insight into foreign affairs and finance that can help rescue China from being carved up.
First of all, Robert Hart tried to convince the foreign powers that never ever try to separate China into several pieces, because China should be refunctional in order to pay up her debt. No one wanted to kill that opportunity to get more money from China.
Robert Hart is able to bring all these people together, and he very cleverly said, yes, okay, we're going to pay this huge indemnity, 450 million ounces of silver, but we do it is structured as a single bond between the Qing dynasty and all the 8 nations that had invaded China. So the interests of those 8 nations are focused on that one bond and on the Qing dynasty paying.
China has avoided partition, but almost all the revenues of the Chinese state are placed under foreign control to pay the war reparations. The Boxer indemnity is a devastating burden. China has no choice but to borrow again from foreign banks. Debt piles on debt. The Chinese government hands responsibility for this huge operation to the organization run by Robert Hart.
The Chinese government wanted to be as simple as possible, so they decided to delegate that to the Maritime Customs Service. And it was rather easier because the Customs Service imposed the tariff tax and stored the money to HSBC.
China has been reduced from an economic superpower to subordinate in less than a century.
I think by the 1850s, 1860s, China's GDP was still about 30% of world GDP, and by the end of the century, it's 6%. So it's an absolute decline, really. It's an absolute decline also in living standards.
From once sitting at the peak of world trade, China is now struggling to function as a state, and its institutions are chronically weak. Desperate last-gasp attempts to modernize fail in the face of rising discontent. China's people begin to lose faith in their rulers, and in 1911, the emperor is overthrown by revolutionaries led by Sun Yat-sen. The silver that helped make China the richest nation in the world is also responsible for bringing 2 dynasties to its knees. The fall of the Qing dynasty and the fall of the Ming dynasty 250 years before it can both be traced back to the kingdom's complex relationship with this white metal.
我就觉得白银在中国和中国历史其实是有个纠缠的，就很多朝代的兴起是因为白银，但很多朝代的覆灭也是和白银有关系。
Silver continues to be a problem in the turmoil that follows the revolution. Warlords take control of individual provinces and civil war breaks out. Taxation paid in silver, the lifeblood of China's economy, cannot be collected. China can barely function.
Each warlord controls one or several provinces. And you can imagine that when warlords control provinces, they issue their own silver as a way to memorize the warlords, right? Like George Washington in the U.S. quarter, right? So same way, so there are different kinds of silver coins. So it was very confusing because people have to recognize whether these silver coins were real or not, were authentic or not.
China's silver currency is becoming even more chaotic. But there is one city on the Chinese coast that is a beacon of economic stability.
Shanghai, storied seaport of the fabled Orient, commercial metropolis of China, and one of the world's greatest seaports.
上海
在19世纪的40年代，就已经对海外开放了。西方人可以在上海合法的居住、经商的这样一个城市。
Shanghai was a trading city. It's existed for many hundreds of years, but until the British presence, it didn't become the entrepot, the big cosmopolitan melting pot of trade and commerce that it is today. You've got a boulevard, a thoroughfare. So there today, it's called Nanjing Road, and along it there were shops, businesses. There were a whole variety of things that said that this city is not Washington, it's New York. In other words, it's a place where people come to do business and to trade.
In the 1920s, Shanghai becomes China's wealthiest port, and this international trade is good for the Maritime Customs Service, which during this time of conflict accounts for nearly 90% of government revenue. And all this government revenue in silver is deposited in a British-owned foreign bank, some of whose founders have grown rich from the opium trade, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC.
Every penny of the custom revenue was stored in the HSBC after 1911. So HSBC had an extremely big, vast cash flow. That was basically the reason why it could become the biggest bank in the Far East in the 20th century.
This allows the bank to build lavish new headquarters on the Bund, Shanghai's famous waterfront. The elegance and grandeur of its interior is described as unsurpassed by any financial or commercial house in Asia and the Far East from Suez to the Bering Sea.
China's demand for goods from abroad grows in leaps and bounds as imports exceed $300 million a year. There is movement everywhere, no standing still.
In the 1920s, Shanghai is one of the biggest cities in the world.
Here is the Occidental quality of Shanghai with its skyscrapers, trolley cars, and semi-foreign atmosphere.
Shanghai is known as the Paris of the East, and the Chinese embrace the spirit of the age. The silversmiths of Shanghai are producing silver cocktail shakers in bulk.
All the elite Chinese went to these fabulous cabarets and nightclubs and ballrooms. And this neighborhood was really the epicenter of that jazz age nightlife in the city in the 1920s and 30s. So you can just imagine that at night, this neighborhood was just this fantastic wonderland of neon lights ablaze and jazz music blaring from these ballrooms and nightclubs.
There is one significant reason why Shanghai can thrive beyond the chaos of post-revolutionary China. It is a Chinese city that is under foreign control. It is also deeply divided, made up of separate zones for foreigners called the International Settlement and the French Concession. All of the 35,000 Europeans who lead a privileged life in prosperous Shanghai are exempt from the laws of China.
Western residents will only observe Western law, which means they want, in what's still Chinese territory, practice Western legal system and legal rules. And those things all, in the end, have enormous consequence on China as a whole.
One of those enormous consequences is that business in Shanghai, foreign and Chinese, is conducted according to Western laws, and that provides Shanghai with the stability to become the biggest holder of silver in China.
Shanghai was unique. It was certainly it was expanding much more quickly than Hong Kong, and the population several times larger. And Shanghai was also become, to a certain degree, after the 20th century, the haven of Chinese business and industry and banking.
But even within booming Shanghai, China's currency remains a problem. Nothing exemplifies this more than its adherence to antiquated silver ingots.
When you have a piece of silver ingots, what do you do when you carry it into the market? You have to literally weigh them, measure them, test them, whether they are genuine silver or not. They are not currencies by count. You cannot count them. You have to measure them.
The system of weighing and assessing the quality of silver and measuring it in taels not only stretches back to medieval times, but it's also far from uniform. Across China, there are as many as 170 different measures of teal.
大家都认识到，银两和银元同时存在，它这种反复的计算、反复的兑换，这个成本实在是太浪费、太不方便，没有理由再坚持下去。
But change in China in the 1930s does not come easily. Just as Prince Gung had tried before him, one man emerges who has the vision and determination to try and reform his country's archaic institutions, in particular, China's centuries-old silver currency. His name is TV Sung.
宋子文他是哈佛毕业嘛，是一个比较西式的人，然后他做事呢，就是说也是一个比较西化的人，这就是其实是他是一个算是一个新式的银行家。
TV Sung stands at the peak of Shanghai society. He is from the most famous family in Republican China. His sisters are all society beauties, and his brother-in-law is China's leader.
当然，宋子文的他有很大的一个抱负，希望要改造中国，改变中国，尤其是在财政制度、预算制度、银行制度、货币制度等这些方面。
As finance minister to the new republic, in April 1933, he calls a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, in which he sets out to radically alter China's currency. Sung's daring proposal is to abolish the silver teal, the unit of Chinese currency which has been used for centuries, and replace it with one standard minted silver coin. But he has a formidable obstacle to overcome. Set against TV Sung's reforming zeal are the native bankers who meet here every day at their power base, the inner garden by the city god temple in the heart of old Shanghai.
钱庄在上海已经有那么大的影响力，可以在一个繁华的地带，然后有这么一个公共集合的地点，这其实是可以看出当时商人自治的一些特点。
The native banks profit directly from China's complex and inefficient currency.
他们的业务计算模式其实和银两有关，此外也是利益，因为他们很多业务就是被银两有关的业务，其实是被钱庄垄断的。
银元和银两兑换的比例是由他规定的，并且要他到他那里去兑换，他都要收手续费。
Despite the opposition of the native banks, TV Sung has the full support of China's modern and foreign banks. On the 5th of April 1933, the silver teal is abolished and becomes an instant and now illegal relic of the past. The new silver dollar is issued featuring Sun Yat-sen, China's first president, and on the reverse is a sailing boat, a symbol of centuries of trade and prosperity.
废粮改元非常重要，那它其实就彻底的使得中国的白银从那个一个称量货币变成一个有统一的一个币制，变成由银两走向了银元，所以这是一个非常重要的过程。
The reforms of TV Sung are celebrated across the world. He makes the cover of Fortune and Time magazines. He is pronounced a financial genius, comparable to Alexander Hamilton, the man behind the creation of America's first national bank. He's even invited to address the American nation in a radio broadcast on NBC. During the broadcast, he stresses the special relationship between America and China.
Some of your most distinguished families were engaged in the China trade. Millions of dollars changed hands without one word being put down in writing. It was a superb example of trust and mutual respect.
TV Sung has achieved one of the great reforms in China's history. At long last, the country has a simple, unified silver currency.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
But almost immediately, a global financial crisis will finally bring an end to China's entanglement with silver, the Great Depression. But surprisingly, during this profound shock to global capitalism, China's use of silver initially gives the country an unexpected benefit.
The world was in recession in the early 1930s because of the stock market crash of 1929, right? And also Germany was in trouble, right? Because of it, China was effectively, under nationalist government, was using one currency, which is silver, which was losing value against most other currencies. So Chinese money was cheap. Other people's money was expensive. So Chinese goods appeared to be cheap because Chinese goods were denominated in silver partially, right? So Chinese goods became cheap. Therefore, China was able to export to foreign countries with relative ease.
But this advantage does not last long. China is about to suffer at the hands of the very country that just 2 years previously had been applauding the financial reforms of TV Soong. An American senator, Key Pittman, demands action. The silver-producing states, including his own state of Nevada, are suffering because the global price of silver is so low. The president bows to pressure and enacts the Silver Purchase Act, which results in America going on a silver buying spree.
The Silver Purchase Act in the U.S., which was largely driven by small mining states, a few mining states in the U.S., ended up driving up the global prices for silver.
With the price of silver rising because of American demand, there is now an unstoppable flow of silver out of China. It's a catastrophe. Banks go under, businesses are starved of loans, industry and agriculture suffer a collapse in prices. The financial crisis becomes an economic crisis and then a social crisis.
So the Chinese government is forced to entertain the idea of a major currency reform and to remove this dependence on silver.
Unable to control its currency, China is forced now, finally after centuries, to abandon silver.
US was forcing China to say, you don't use silver. The US was telling China, get off silver.
And in 1935, they do exactly that. They throw in the towel and take China off the silver standard.
Silver comes to an end. The silver story in China really comes to an end in very abrupt fashion.
1935 marks the end of 6 centuries of silver currency in China, and before long, silver artifacts will disappear as well. When the communists take control of China in 1949, silver is a distant memory. That is, until a chance discovery 20 years later in this mansion on America's East Coast. It was once the home of Robert Bennett Forbes, a prominent 19th century China trader who built his fine house with the profits he made from buying and selling tea and opium. His great-grandson, H.A. Crosby Forbes, develops a keen interest in the family silver when he inherits the house.
Crosby was interested in so many different things, but certainly one of his greatest passions was the subject of Chinese export silver. This was a subject that really had been primarily forgotten in the 20th century. Crosby really began looking at this subject critically decades before almost anyone else did.
In 1975, Crosby Forbes publishes Chinese Export Silver. It is the first scholarly work on the subject. The study of one silver artifact illustrates how neglected this unique Chinese craft has become.
This is an extraordinary teapot in England, but by the 19th century, it had been completely forgotten that this was made in China. It was a celebrated piece of English silver, published widely in books on Old English silver, and indeed, even in the 19th century, this served as a model for silversmiths who were becoming masters. Then Crosby really was the one who first re-identified this as being Chinese rather than English.
Today, more than 40 years after Crosby Forbes' work shed light on an exquisite but forgotten Chinese craft, export silver is now returning to modern China. It's a window into the past and is a force for creativity in China today. Alan Chan is an artist and one of Hong Kong's leading designers.
I collected because I find a certain kind of beauty that is beyond comparison, because I think this export silver carry a bit of cultural history. This has been used as an eyeglass case. So the entire composition inspired me as a graphic designer. I think the way the bamboo leaves go together with the calligraphy, this could be a cover design for a book, this could be inspiration for manual cover. This is wonderful. It's amazing because this is a sort of pepper set, you know. You can put a condiment here, you can put your toothpicks here. It's a beautiful conversation piece to put on top while you're having dinner, you know. They use this as a business card holder over 100 years ago. So that means they're already using business card over 100 years ago in China. I find it always hard to believe how on earth they can come up with such an intricate design and also craftsmanship. You see different kind of costume, how people would dress over 100 years ago. This is like a 3D movie showing you the story of a typical courtyard, how people live and how their everyday lifestyle could be. You know. Chinese mirror don't usually come in with a handle like this. And to incorporate a dragon into such a European shape, you look at it. The tail start from here and move around the circle and they end up like here. I think this is just beautiful. I look at this mirror, I would say, wow, who was the beauty in front of the mirror other than me 100 years ago?
In past centuries, silver demonstrated China's economic might, and it still does today in the country's highest diplomatic courts. In 2014, when China plays host to the leaders of the Asian and Pacific world, it gives each one an exquisite silver gift that spoke not only to craftsmanship, but also an acknowledgement of China's historic relationship with silver. Today, China is once more the biggest importer of silver in the world. The industries producing the goods that help power our globalized world, consumer electronics, mobile phones, electric cars, all need silver. And they are produced here in China on an enormous scale. These workers are preparing to start the early shift at one of the biggest factories in China. They are part of a 1,200-strong workforce who help harness the power of the sun with silver. 70 million of these solar batteries are produced each month, and inside every 6 by 6 inch panel, there is a film less than the width of a human hair of silver.
那么1个月大约会用到白银是7吨的量。因为这个银呢，它具有良好的这种导电性，还有稳定性，所以呢，它是太阳电池，特别是晶体硅太阳电池中首选的这种电极材料。它呢，主要是在生产过程当中，我们采用是丝网印刷的这种技术，使银浆料那么先在电池片的表面形成这种山线性结构，然后经过烘干。 还有退火之后形成银电极，银电极呢可以将电池片它发出来的这种电荷收集起来， 就可以导出，所以说它在电池片当中是重要的这么一种材料。太阳发电是我们现在目前正在建设的这种安全的、这种高效的这种现在可持续发展的这种现代能源体系的重要的一部分。太阳发电是非常重要的，不光对于中国重要，对于世界，对于我们整个人类的发展都非常的重要。
The largest solar energy farms in the world are in China. They consume the world's silver to help power the country's relentless industries, whose output seems to be unstoppable, but in constant need of new markets.
The Chinese economy now is already the largest in terms of its production of real goods. Goods you can touch, like clothing, like cameras, like TV sets, right? It is already 27% bigger than the US economy in terms of producing real goods. In this regard, the Chinese economy is no different from the British economy in the early days, in the early 19th century, right? So the Chinese businesses would want to expand.
The skylines of modern China testify to its economic dominance and its seemingly endless potential. But modern China allows the world to once again see what this country has always been.
For most of human history, China has represented the world's foremost economic power. Really, if you look at it, China had just napped for a little bit in the 19th century. There's Napoleon's very famous phrase, when China, awakens, the world will tremble.
China heralded globalization by throwing in its lot with silver in 1581. It triggered a new epoch in world history with its need for this precious metal. Today, money has many forms, and most transactions are electronic. But in the Chinese language, the character for money says silver, and the characters for bank says silver shop. Pointed reminders of how central silver was for centuries in shaping China's economy and how it shaped the rest of the world.
也许我们今天不再用白银，但是和白银有关的记忆、教训，其实都还在我们生活当中、生活周围，只是看不见而已。所以我觉得，如果谁违背了这一点，不能从白银的故事中吸取教训的话，谁都会付出代价。